Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to the ICA and the New Music Committee for putting on this awesome event. I am going to share my screen and get my slides up here and we will get started. And I got to go back to the very beginning. Hold on a sec. I got to go back to the beginning of my slideshow. I was all set to show you my very last slide. Okay, there we go. All right, so today we're going to talk about improvisation, sort of with an eye towards maybe if you haven't improvised very much or you aren't comfortable with it, how you can sort of get into it and why you should. And then also if you are comfortable with improvisation, how we can teach that to our students. So that's what we'll be talking about today. And just want to start out with the why. Why should we study and teach improvisation? So we're going to talk through some the why of improvisation, some different types of improvisation that appear in contemporary works. And then the last half of our session is going to be sort of interactive where I'll play and you can play on your own a bit and we'll try some things out. So why should we study it? So number one, improv can be intimidating and uncomfortable. We can have this sort of fear of making mistakes, especially if we're mostly trained in a classical tradition and we haven't done a lot of jazz, right? And so sometimes people feel like they don't know what to play, they're worried about making mistakes. So if we study it, we can just get more comfortable with it. And we don't often teach improvisation outside of the field of jazz. So if you're in middle high school and you're in jazz band, you might learn to improvise in the jazz tradition. But if you're more like the orchestra track or just the concert band track as a player, you might really not encounter ideas about how to improvise or get a chance to practice it. So number three, improvisation is a core musicianship skill. And we know that players and composers since the beginning of time have improvised. We all are born knowing how to improvise as children, as babies, like that's what we do. We play with sound, right? And we know that Mozart and Bach and all of the great composers improvised as part of their practice. We know that cadenzas were improvised in the classical period, and so there's a lot of reasons why improvisation should be considered and is a core musicianship skill and shouldn't just be relegated to the jazz area. Improvisation can inform the skills of interpretation and composition. And I was just in John Russell's session earlier this morning. I know a lot of you were in there as well and got to hear him talk about his study in improv comedy and just techniques of that sort of the theater improv, and then how he uses improvisation to generate material for his compositions. And it can be a really great entry point towards composition. In a way, improvisation is kind of live, spontaneous composition anyway, right? But even if we don't compose, it can really help us understand and get ideas for interpretation, right? And lastly, improvisation appears frequently in contemporary music, and that's what we're talking about this weekend, right, is new music. So often the discussion about new music goes towards the pieces, the composers, and the techniques, the extended techniques. But we don't often talk about the improvisational skills that are needed to perform so many of these works. So let's talk about some of the ways improvisation can appear in contemporary music. So just kind of quickly go over these and talk about what they are in case you're not familiar or want some, and then we'll look at some examples. So Bach's notation, these are sort of in order of left to right from more structured to less structured, roughly. Bach's notation is one that probably everyone has encountered at some point. It's even used in music for young bands these days and younger ensembles because it's something that's really approachable. So it's where pitch or rhythmic material is presented in a box typically, and then the performer can sometimes choose when to play it, or they can switch between different cells within the box as they wish. So you get your pitch and rhythm material usually clearly there, so it takes away the pressure of generating the material yourself. You're just sort of deciding timing and listening and deciding when you're going to play it. Spatial notation can be spatialized rhythmically or on a pitch axis, but essentially, usually you're looking at music without a time signature where note values are shown using space on the page, or pitch information is given from low to high, and it's a little bit more abstract than notating exact pitches. And that requires some improvisation or interpretation, you could call it, as far as timing and how you're going to play those. Instructions. You'll see instructions, used with all these other types as well. And, all of these types can cross-pollinate and be combined. But some pieces have text or verbal instructions about what to play. Pitch, rhythm, material, different limitations on what you can or can't do, or the style or the form. And as we'll see, some works consist of only text. Then there's graphic scores. So this can be visual art, any kind of symbols, and they could be abstract or they can be more representational. And then sometimes they come along with instructions on how to interpret the graphic score. Often the instructions are even longer than the graphic score itself. And then sometimes it's just more free. Through conducting, and conduction is another way that we improvise in contemporary music. So there's works where the conductor is going to indicate sort of pathways through a nonlinear score by giving numbers, and we'll look at one of those, or signals on where to go, what to do next. And then there's a whole tradition of conduction, which was developed by Butch Morris, I think in Chicago, where he developed this system of hand signals to indicate different types of musical material and who should play what when. And essentially it's used in a large group, or maybe small group as well, but it's used in a group setting for the conductor to sort of do live composition with the instruments and the players as a sonic palette. So that's sort of an interesting tradition where the players improvise and the conductor also improvises. And then there's free improvisation. And this is actually the most rare thing to see in contemporary music because, usually contemporary music is highly notated and composers want to have a little more control over the result, I guess, of how the piece sounds. But sometimes you'll see sections of free improv used, or you'll see something that's mostly free with just minimal instructions. And free improv, in a way, is the hardest to do because the limitations are an important part of what makes improvisation interesting and approachable. So let's look at some examples. I live in Seattle, and I do a lot of playing with the Seattle Modern Orchestra and other groups, and we have a really cool tradition in the Seattle area that there's just a lot of cross-pollination between the jazz scene in Seattle, which is very strong, and the improvised music scene, and then the contemporary music scene. So there's a lot of crossover, people that are involved in both, and improvisation plays a really big part, I think, of just the creativity that we see in contemporary music in Seattle. So just last weekend, I played with Seattle Modern Orchestra. We premiered a piece by Caroline Louise Miller, who's a composer out of Portland. And this is just an example of box notation where we have some material, we have some instructions on how to play these air tones, and then within that, it just, down here, it just sort of says ad lib through the rest of the page practically. So then we're just listening, deciding when to play what. Example of spatial notation here as far as the length of notes. This opening, and we can see it doesn't have a time signature. There's rough note values with the closed note heads, the open note heads, and some lines indicating spatially how long the notes should be, but there's a lot of room for interpretation here. And this is a piece I played by Huck Hodge, who's a composer on faculty at the University of Washington. Last year with Seattle Modern Orchestra, we played a work by Bethany Young called Orbits, where you take the upper half of the bass clarinet and put a tube in and extend the bass clarinet, and then you end up putting the tube into PVC pipes. It's a really wild piece, and I loved it. This is an example of the score. So the C is the clarinet line, and with the tubing you can get all this crazy rich multiphonics from the bass clarinet. And so here we see sort of a spatial notation regarding pitch to give sort of a rough outline of the contour and the gesture, and then the performer can improvise and interpret that as they wish. Instructions. This piece by William O. Smith, a mentor of mine who lived and worked in Seattle for most of his life, and who you probably all know. This was one of his last pieces he wrote, and we played it on his last concert in 2019 before he passed away in 2020. This was for a group of clarinetists. He was on the solo clarinet part, which really is sort of written as a free improvisation. It just says ad lib throughout. But then we have a group of high clarinets and low clarinets. And here he used timings to show when we're going to switch to different sections of the piece. And then within each section, it's just descriptions of types of timbres and sounds that you might be hearing. And so for the performer, there's a lot of interpretation here. We have a lot more instructions down below here, and then we definitely asked him a lot of questions during the rehearsal about like what he was looking for. So verbal instructions can be a big part of some of these pieces as well. And then some pieces can just be all text. So Pauline Oliveros has a lot of pieces like this that are kind of designed for improvising in a group, not necessarily for performance, although they can be performed and they have been performed a lot. But some of them are almost just more explorations or group therapy or just play. And that's what I love about her pieces. So her books, Sonic Meditations, and then there's a book called Deep Listening that has some other pieces, just really awesome to check out if you're interested in improvisation, especially through text instructions. Then you have graphic scores, which usually require a lot of improvisation to interpret. This is from Sarah Watts, her multiphonic miniatures for bass clarinet, and she has a new one coming out that's an adaptation for the clarinet as well. And this piece also has another page or two of instructions with it, but this is essentially the score. And we see obviously some art, some visuals, but then there's also some numbers, I don't know if you can see it, that they associate with certain multiphonics. And then she has instructions about how to interpret these M's with the lines at the bottom. And so then the performer here is sort of taking all this material and developing an interpretation by looking at the image, maybe deciding a pathway through the image. So there's a lot of co-creating going on between the performer and the composer. And then this is another piece I just played last weekend with Seattle Modern Orchestra called Meadows. It's a compostable, plantable score that had wildflower seeds in it that we tore up as we performed. And this had instructions on how to interpret as well. So each of the plants that are represented through the printing had some cue words that went along with that plant. And so we practiced as a group, just looking at the cue words and the picture and playing what each plant would sound like. And then in the performance, each person individually could sort of decide which plant they were looking at or thinking about, or hop between them or focus on one. So it was really bordering on free improvisation, but with this sort of inspiration or spark coming from the score itself, and then the score as an art object that was torn up and distributed to the audience. So really cool example of improvisation, a really fun piece to play too. An example of how conducting can guide improvisation. So this is just from an Earl Brown piece we did with Seattle Modern Orchestra a few years ago. And this is from the score. So there were large sections with numbers, and the conductor would hold up numbers to tell us which section we were going to play, and they could go back and forth between the numbers. And within, you can see it's just sort of a series of pitches in number 2. So we would kind of find our way through that. In number 3, it was more conducted, so it's kind of a mix of improvisation and following the notated music for the performers. And then we'll look at a few free improv examples. So I often collaborate with my husband, Greg Dixon, in our duo Odd Partials, clarinet and electronics. And lately we've been doing a lot of clarinet and synthesizer stuff. So this is one of those pieces. It has an opening that is notated, and then he just notates free minor blues in C minor, riffing on the theme, and then some dynamics. So this is a section that we just sort of developed together by trying things out where he was improvising on synthesizer and I improvised on bass clarinet. And we just sort of let it evolve. It was different every time, but it always had, you know, that blues quality, the settings on the synthesizer that he was using. So while it was a free improv, in a way, it also was a cohesive piece of music or section of the piece that's had similar qualities each time too. And then with the sound ensemble here in Seattle, I played this piece, one of the winners of our, I think it was the high school composition competition. And this composer wrote, it's all notated up to this spot, but then they wrote all of a sudden here, solo, improvise in the style of contemporary jazz, E flat whole tone, and it's in 5/8. And it's like the whole page. And then there were a few other chord changes sprinkled in here. So this is, you know, bordering on jazz improvisation, which is could be a whole other category. But it just goes to show what you might find in a piece of contemporary music. And then lastly, a completely free improv example from Sean Osborne's, another great player, composer, and improviser here in Seattle. His piece Character Duets, which is wonderful, for 2 clarinets. Each movement is dedicated to a different clarinetist. It's all notated except for movement 4, which is dedicated to another wonderful improviser in the Seattle area, Jesse Canterbury. And the score for number 4 is just improvise a short movement. So there you're improvising with your friend. Hopefully you're friends with them on stage. And I got to perform this with Sean, and it was really fun. So we just sort of came up with what we were doing on the spot, played it for about 45 seconds, and then we were done. So those are some examples of how you might see improvisation show up in the contemporary context. Now, let's talk about how we can study and teach improvisation. So especially if you have never done it or you really feel uncomfortable with it, I highly recommend just starting super simple. And if you have a student who's never done it, so just take away the pitch altogether. Just take one note and play around with one note. Maybe you do octaves, maybe you try some different rhythms, but just playing around with one note can be a great way to start. Another thing you can do is just play with one rhythm. Take a rhythm and play the same rhythm on different pitches and see what evolves. And there was a great presentation from the Jazz and Global Music Committee not too long ago, and that was one of the things we did in that session, was just play around with one rhythm. And we also played around with a drone, which we're going to do here in a minute. So starting simply and giving some really strict limitations can be an entry point just for playing around with sound. And I do recommend focus on a spirit of play. I mean, especially I've done this with, you know, beginners all the way up through adults, and having a spirit of, we're just playing around with musical materials. We're not worried about making mistakes. We're not trying to make something even that we can perform someday. We're just playing. And a lot of times I improvise with my students and try to encourage that mindset. And we keep it short as well. Usually we'll do like 1 minute, or we'll look at the clock and we'll say, we'll improvise for 2 minutes and then we're going to stop. And so then, you know, you have a natural ending point and you can stop and talk about how it went and, you know, what was fun about it and maybe what didn't work. All of these are kind of a form of limitations. And in all art forms, the limitations can be what breeds creativity. And we're going to talk about some ways to use limitations, and then we're going to try some improv with limitations, and I'll get to hear from you a little bit. So one of my favorite things I've been using in recent years is this creative limitation menu. And this is from a book by Steve Treseler. He's a Seattle-based saxophonist and jazz educator. And his book, Creativity Triggers for Musicians, I highly recommend. If you're interested in improv, you could use it with ensembles, you can use it with lessons, you can just work through it on your own. It's got tons of just prompts and things that you can that you can just try out to play around with improvisation. It can even be a trigger for composition and musical creativity in other ways as well. And this PDF is available for like 99 cents on Amazon, and you can get it for free by signing up for his email list. And it is like he's literally never emailed me since I signed up for it. So don't worry about getting spammed. Anyway, let's look at the creative limitation menu. So the idea, the exercise from Steve is to pick two of these things, pick two rules that you're going to follow in your improvisation. And you really don't need more than that because your creativity and your ideas will supply the rest. So what I want to do right now is I'm going to do a little improv, like a 1-minute improv, and I would like to ask you all to take a look at this list and just like raise your hand and choose one of these rules. Well, we'll choose two together, and then I'll do a short improv on that, and you can join me as well if you want. So go ahead and raise your hand if you want to choose one. And the only thing is they have to be from two different categories, right? So it could be one pitch rule and then one rhythm rule. So you could raise your hand or you could type in the chat. I want to hear from you. What rules? Okay, so Jessica says choose 3 pitches. All right, 3 pitches. Do y'all want to help me choose the pitches? Or should I pick? You could just get on your mic and shout things out. It looks like we're not feeling like doing that today. So, use the tritone. We've got A, okay. High to low, perfect. Okay, so we have our 2 rules. We've got 3 pitches, and the improv has to work from high to low. And we'll do it in the course of 1 minute. I'm going to stop my share for a minute. So the pitches are going to be tritone. We have A, so we'll do A, E flat, and I need one more pitch. I don't want to go to the E because that's the Simpsons theme. So maybe I'll go to B. So A, B, and D sharp. All right, I'll stop my share so you can see me a little better. So I'm going to try to go for about 1 minute. And I don't have a low D sharp, so I couldn't go all the way as low as I wanted. But there's a little improvisation based on the creative limitation menu. Now what I'd like to do is encourage you all to choose a couple limitations on your own. I'm hoping you all have instruments. I can't see you, but I'm hoping that you're kind of playing along with me here, or even just imagining what you might play, even if you don't have your instrument with you. So I'm going to put on a drone just to provide, a drone can just sort of provide a harmonic anchor point, right, that you can move away from and come back to. And it can be really useful in creating improvisations. So I'm going to put on a drone. I think I might have to share my screen again for that to share my sound. And I will put the creative limitation menu back up. And I like to encourage you to choose 2 rules on your own. And I'm not going to play this time. And I'm going to play the drone for 1 minute. And we're all going to improvise or imagine ourselves improvising. Here we go. The B flat drone. That's a B flat. Okay, and that was 1 minute. So 1 minute goes by pretty quickly. Uh, does anybody have anything they want to share about how their improvisation went before we go on to the next thing?
I don't have my horn out, but I was just using an ink pen and thinking about it. But I'm really, really impressed with the list, and I was kind of drawn to just using a not a detached, but a connected style of note, and then going back and forth between that tonic pitch, and I was kind of humming to myself because I don't have my horn out, of course, but um and really listening in when the notes got crunchy and kind of leaning into it, and it's a nice feeling to sort of always feel the tonic. So I really think that the drone is really helpful, and it also helps with your sense of pitch. You're obviously using a drone, you know, and really leaning into those non-chordal tones that sort of exist there. So that's what I was doing with my ink pen.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Jessica. Yeah, I find that using a drone, you sort of have built-in harmonic goal in a way. Yeah, it forces you to think in maybe a more tonal way than you might want to all the time, but especially for students and anybody less experienced, it's a really good practice.
Do you have a go-to drone site or app that you're using
Uh,
um, that you
Not
could
really.
recommend?
This was, I don't remember where I got this. It's like a tempura drone. So it sounds
We
sort of,
actually just had a session a couple weeks ago on Lunch and Learn with Meg York, and she also
uh,
recommended some a drone app. So
okay.
we can reshare that if you are interested.
There's
But
some apps
she,
you can use.
yeah,
Yeah. I often just use like my tuner. Tonal Energy has a lot of different instrument sounds that you can use and set the octaves, although it's not quite as musical sounding as having like the tempura, which sort of ebbs and flows. Yeah. Well, let's go on to the next thing because we're almost out of time. Jessica said it was okay if we went a little bit longer, although I know there's a YouTube session starting pretty soon. So let me show you the next thing, which is a movement from A Piece of Mine. I'll briefly introduce it. This piece is called Paper Woman. It's in 5 movements and it's all text instructions. Um, yeah, I'll try to not say too much about it, but there is no pitch material, and so the idea is that each player, it's for any solo instrument, so not just for clarinet, but for each player, and the player can use the blank staves that are in the score to write down their pitch content ideas that they want to use for their performance or just to play around with. So this is one of the movements from that, and I just want to make sure that I'm still going. Okay, so if you could let me know what pitches I should use. I'm supposed to use only 2 pitches. I'll go ahead and play a little example of how I might interpret this one. So, sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to see the chat and my slides at the same time, and I don't know how to do it. So Jessica says G. Let me get rid of that so we can look at it. And anybody else? Sorry, I'm struggling with where my chat went now. Ah, there we go. B. All right. Thank you. Jessica and Angel are on help. So let's go to back to the score, and we'll do G and B. And I'm just going to do a short version. So these movements can be long or they can be short. So that is Read Woman movement from Paper Woman. That was really fun. And I find the hardest thing about this movement is the instruction, do not use your intellect, because I really wanted this movement to have a sense of play and just a letting go and not trying to control it and over intellectualize what you're playing. So it's really kind of associated with being a baby in a way. Any questions? We can talk about anything now for a couple minutes, and my email, rachelyoder@gmail.com, if you want to get a hold of me. Paper Woman is available at Camco, or you can contact me. It's only available on paper though, so it's kind of sacrilegious to be putting a scanned version of it up here on the presentation, but you can order it on paper for $5. So that's that.
Can you show the score? Because I think you had it in the slides for Paper Woman.
The score again?
Yeah, could you, I just want to look at it one more time.
Sure. Am I still sharing or no? Did I go away?
No.
Yeah. I'll go back to it. And I might have a version of the, yeah, I don't know if I have a version of the score here with me, but.
Well, what was your thought process in working on this piece? I'm really interested to know how you approached this, coming from, I know you have a background obviously in contemporary music and improvisation, but just as a person who does not have that experience, looking at a score like that makes me have a little bit of anxiety.
Yeah, so part of the reason that or one of my goals in writing this piece was actually to provide something to play with and a source of inspiration, even if people had never improvised before. So like maybe an etude even, something that you can just play in the comfort of your own home. The first movement starts with playing a tentative note and then shushing yourself. And one of the instructions is play as if you are an imposter. And so many of us feel like an imposter when we try to improvise if we are not used to doing it. And so this piece asks you to take on that role and then gradually transform into an overconfident version of yourself. So that's the first movement. But I want to show you something that was a big inspiration for me, which was Yoko Ono's book, Grapefruit. And in this book, she has, I mean, it's full of very short instruction pieces, and this is from like the late 60s. So there's things like, let me see if I can find one of the more musical ones. Some of them are music, some of them are art, and most of them are just more conceptual and not actually designed to um, ever be uh, performed, or they're impossible to be performed. So let's see if I can find one of the ones for orchestra. I should have bookmarked it. Well, there's one called Concert Piece. Here's the whole piece. When the curtain rises, go hide and wait until everybody leaves you. Come out and play. That was from 1963. So they're poems, they're concepts, and some of them you can actually perform or try to perform, and then some of them are pretty much impossible because they're so abstract.
Hi.
Hi, Les.
As a jazz player, I'm all ears as far as what this presentation was going to be and what it has turned out to be. And as someone who has studied jazz improv my entire life, in fact, I'll be practicing in about an hour from now, and it's a lifelong process. And to improvise in jazz, as you know, the amount of music theory that you have to know, the amount of technical ability, is hearing, listening is beyond anything. So for me to see you make this presentation with regard to contemporary music for people to start improvising, and I actually was at the conference and saw concerts with more improvising in it than I had ever seen in quite a while. So it's great to see that this is coming to the forefront, and I completely approve and endorse the approach that you are taking. It's really, really fantastic. And like I say, I came from a background of studying scales and chords and arpeggios and solos and transcribing and everything like that. If there's anything I could add to maybe the drone concept, would be some kind of backing track that just plays one chord. And it doesn't, it would mean initially you would play the triad of that chord, which classical musicians know their scales and chords backwards and forwards. So really, improv should be a natural for all of you classical musicians out there, because you guys know anyone else. And I think something you mentioned that might be a, a, uh, a stumbling block for people would be fear and judgment. Because as soon as you play something that's not on the paper, you're going, is that right? No, I didn't like that. And you're judging yourself immediately. And as we know, with 12-tone music, you could play a chord, but even jazz players feel that you could play anything on any chord as long as you occasionally come back to chord tones. So anyone that's looking to try the drone concept, kick it up a notch to an actual chord, play the triads. One thing that I do very, very often is take a standard tune and, another fear, I would say, and you could agree or disagree, of classically trained musicians would be, how do I swing? Well, don't worry about it. Don't take that out of the equation. Just play the music theory. So if you see a chord symbol that says D minor 7, you guys know what that is. Just play those, not even the seventh, just play the triads. And against a backing track of a concert C minor 7, and just go back and forth with those three notes. And there's that restriction concept that you just did. Pick three notes. Well, how about if those three notes are three notes of the triad? Now you really have something, and you're moving a little bit into the jazz world. And one last thing is the presentation with Jonathan Russell a little while ago. He mentioned Eric Dolphy. Oh man, go listen to Eric Dolphy. Eric Dolphy, as far as free jazz, unrestricted, bass clarinet, monster, and 1960s. Not 2025, 1960s. So anyway, great presentation. Thought I'd throw in my 2 cents. Keep it up.
All right, thanks so much, Les. Yeah, I love that perspective from a jazz improviser. And yeah, I will say that sometimes I do have a bit of a jazz background, although I don't perform jazz professionally. But when I help my students learn to create improvisations, they bring in their jazz band pieces, and they're like, "What do I do?" One of the first things that we start with is like, just play the root, and get a pulse going, and just play the root. Now play the root in third. And so, like you said, just really um, increasing the limitations can provide that entry point and that confidence.
Here's a very interesting fact. Benny Goodman never played more than triad notes. He wasn't even aware of the deep music theory that came, after him with Charlie Parker, who obviously extended the chords to, ninths, 11th, sharp 11, 13, flat 13, all of the upper echelon of chords. But Goodman, he only played root thirds and fifths. It's just that he organized it so clearly. He was such a master player. And of course, he mastered the art of swing because that was the world he was in. But the theory doesn't have to be that deep. It really doesn't. Just the basics, and don't judge yourself. Great
Yeah,
stuff.
thanks for that. Yeah, and there's a lot more parameters other than pitch to think about. And that's kind of the point with some of these explorations, right? If you only can use one pitch, how can you change up the timbre? How can you change up the gesture that you're doing? So, thank
And
you.
introduce rhythm. With
Yes.
limited pitches, now you have to really explore all of the rhythmic possibilities. So that strengthens that aspect of your playing and your creativity.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you, Rachel, for coming in and sharing this presentation with us.